My name is Tim Stenson. I'm an associate professor here at the school for our guests. And my role now, my job right now is to introduce Fred Stelle, this evening's lecturer. It's both a privilege and personally very satisfying to have the opportunity to introduce Fred. It gives me a chance to express my high regard for him and for his work. Fred Stelle is a distinguished alum of our school, indeed a good friend of the school, and a practicing architect based in Bridgehampton on Long Island. Much of Fred's office's work is on Long Island, but there is an international reach to his practice. He has projects in Switzerland, in Spain, and now recently in China. The work of Stelle Architects has been recognized on many occasions with a range of design awards, including numerous AIA Excellence in Architectural Awards, a New York State AIA Award of Merit, and in 2005, an AIA Achievement Award in recognition of distinguished high levels of design and practice over a minimum of a 10-year stretch. So it is, I believe, as an award-winning designer of things built that Fred will speak to us this evening. And it is in relation to this particular aspect of architecture, that is building, that I'd like to take a moment and elaborate my own appreciation for Fred Stelle's design work. Over history and from time to time, architects and theoreticians have said interesting things, made pronouncements regarding the relation of building to architecture. For example, Mies van der Rohe is reported to have said that architecture begins when two bricks are thoughtfully put together. Louis Kahn, on many occasions, famously interviewed bricks and asked them what they wanted to be. Our colleague from the University of Pennsylvania, David Leatherbarrow, pithily remarked that architecture is built somewhere. And going the other direction, the 80s gadfly and occasional Yale studio critic Leon Creer claimed, "I am an architect because I don't build." I think Fred Stelle is an architect precisely because he builds, and builds quite precisely. Fred's projects are characterized by clear, thoughtful, and concise strategies conceived with great sensitivity to site and landscape, and characterized as well by careful, thorough, and impeccable execution. And I'll try to get at this with a quick story. This past fall, and as part of a studio that Fred and I were teaching together, I was out in the Hamptons with a group of students, and Fred was taking us around, showing us a number of recently completed residential projects, some by him, many by others. All of the projects, and I want to emphasize this, all of them were compelling as projected, as designed, and all done by accomplished architects, many of whom whose names are very familiar to you. And so it was especially interesting to see them in the flesh, as built. And as one might expect, some were better executed than others, some well conceived in detail and built well, others not. But in this regard, and in my opinion, Fred Stelle's houses were in a league of their own, where strategy and precise terms of material execution were in carefully calibrated balance. And the result is a beautiful and subtle effect. The architecture recedes, but then when you turn around, it's right there and it's perfectly positioned. It's sort of like a perfectly played symphony. Really masterful work. So this subtle and powerful potential in architecture, as I'm sure many can appreciate, is difficult to achieve, often elusive, but present in much of Fred's work. And it's also something that can only be experienced firsthand. It cannot be mediated. So if you ever have the chance, I would encourage you to go see this work. And though we can't materialize one of Fred's houses here now, in our midst, nor even better, transport all of ourselves to a kind of breezy summer afternoon on Hampton's Beach. We are fortunate to have Fred here this afternoon to share his work. And so please join me in welcoming Fred Stelle.
Hi there. I have two questions before we start. Does anybody know where Bridgehampton is? Okay, well, if I start telling lies, don't correct me. And the second is, does anybody know who Tim was talking about? Seriously, thanks, Tim, and especially thanks to Dean Robbins and Professor French and the school for asking me to come here today and torture you. And I would like to fashion this in the manner of a kind of a conversation. So I have 60 images, and so I'm going to say what I have to say about the images. If you see something that you want to ask about or you want to comment on, please interrupt me. And I'm happy to take questions or comments during the course of the discussion because, they call architecture a practice, and I am certainly still practicing. And so all of your thoughts will be welcome. And maybe someday I'll stop practicing and actually get to do it for real. Opportunities like this don't arise all the time for me. I live in kind of a backwater, and I don't always get to discover or think about the meaning of things. And I just wonder if you out there in the course of your school or your work think about the meaning of things. Do you ever wonder what things mean? Do you ever wonder what your work means, your school means, your relationships mean, and what life means? I don't think about it a lot, but certainly not in the past, but this has given me an opportunity to think about it. And so I think I've learned a couple of things. One is that as I get older and do look at my work, that I find that there's a thread in it and that it does have meaning to me. So I hope that some of that meaning comes through tonight for you, and I hope that you'll find something useful in this. So let's get going. I think in many ways that we live in a perfect world. I'm an optimist. I don't take myself too seriously, and I look for the opportunities in life. But I didn't always think that. When I started architecture school here, and by the way, I'm one of you. I know you don't think I look like you, but I think I look like you. When I started architecture school here, it was a little bit like going to school in a foreign country whose language you didn't speak. Listening to my teachers talk, and even my fellow students talk about what we were doing was totally beyond me. And I think it was my first 2 years of architecture school, probably the most difficult period of my academic career. And the only other part of that that was equally difficult was when I finished my thesis. Because as Professor Massey said to me earlier on, it's the abyss. When the thesis is done, it's the abyss. What do you do? And I woke up the morning after I finally got a good night's sleep when my thesis was done and said to myself, now what? Now what do I do? So, and up until that point, I suspect, like you, my life had been very directed. And now it was up to me to direct my life. And you might say that, in a way, I came to realize that I did grow up in an architectural environment. Not a conventional architectural environment. I grew up in a rural area. And I grew up in a funny Italian house that everybody told me was architecture, although I didn't know what they were talking about. When we moved in, it had no heating, it had no lights, it had no running water, it had no insulation. And my father was an engineer. My mother was a business person and pretty accomplished in her field. She used to save everything she could. She recycled saran wrap and aluminum foil and drippings from bacon to make them into kitchen soap. It was kind of crazy. And one of our neighbors was Edward Larrabee Barnes, who many of you may know. This is the haystack school that he did in Maine. I think it was done in the early 60s, but it's considered one of the finest summer art camps. And he recently died and was the recipient of the AIA 25-year award for both this building and also for his career. And after completing my internship, I worked for him. He was my mentor. And after working for him for a few years, building an addition to his house, I started my own practice. And at that time, my mother and father informed me that they wanted to build a new house because this Italianate house that I grew up in was a complete energy hog. And so they wanted to build an energy efficient house. My father designed power plants and knew firsthand very well the damage that they were causing. And the new house that we were going to design was going to be less than half the size of the house I grew up in. I apologize for these images. At the time that I built this house, I had no idea that maybe I should preserve some record of what I did. Actually, the house still stands today. And the strategy was to build less, to build a house that was both actively and passively working in solar, and to make it a house within a house. And I'll show you the plan in a minute. And the components of the house consisted of the house itself. I don't know, is this thing working? No, it's not working. So you'll see in the site plan, the lower left is the house. It has this kind of Z shape, which are the three elements of the solar panels. And then there's two other outbuildings. One of them is a guest cottage in the middle that just was a converted corn crib and was our place when we came home to stay or when guests came to stay and was never heated. The house itself was pretty simple, and it only had one bedroom. As I said, the other bedrooms are contained in the other building. The two main rooms of the house, the living room and the dining room, could be closed off with sliding panels. You'll see the arrows in the, oh, there we go. No, now it's not working. You'll see the arrows coming out of the walls. There were some sliding panels that came out of the wall. So you could close off those large parts of the house during the night when they had to be heated, and you lived basically in the smaller rooms. And they heated the bedroom, all they heated was the study, the entry, the kitchen, and the bedroom. And the other rooms didn't get heated at night. Oh, thanks. Sorry. We investigated a whole bunch of technologies. At the time, technology was evolving around solar. And we looked at photovoltaics, which were in their infancy. We looked at wind systems. We looked at both flat plate and concentrating types of collectors. And ultimately, we just settled on the simplest technology, which was flat plate collectors and a thermal mass rock room for space heating. So the flat plate collectors would collect warm air during the day and store it in a room that was basically a room full of rocks. And the goal for the architecture was to try to find some form for the house that both reflected its solar capacity, but didn't look tacked on, or didn't look sort of like an afterthought. So the solar component of the house was the driver for this house. The panels needed to be set at a certain angle. All of you know that by now, but the panels, depending on your latitude, have to be set at a certain angle, and that drove the form of the roof. This house was built by me and some volunteers and friends, including one or two classmates, who some of you here may know, and it still stands today. Any questions?
What year is this from?
This house was built in 1976, so I'm reluctant to say that. You know, a girl never confesses her age. So the next project is what we call a ranch house, and it's a different kind of intervention. The intervention in the first project was intervening in a kind of runaway energy consumption that today seems even more poignant than it did in 1976. I have to say, 1976 was not an arbitrary date. The reason we built the house then was it was just after the first oil embargo of the early 70s. So there was a real sense that we had an energy crisis we had to face up to. The second project is not a new house, it's a renovation. It's an alteration of a type that exists across the American landscape, the ranch house. Although in this case, the ranch house, the original, which is on the right, has been, was not carried out in its true right-inspired form. Nevertheless, it was a house that was in pretty good shape, and we felt that we needed to preserve something of it. It also had a very limited budget, but fairly high design aspirations. And the design brief from the owners was to expand the ordinary ranch house into a 5-bedroom house and to reorient it from the street to the rear of the property. And the other brief from the owners, they're very modest people, was to try to keep this thing, keep it simple so it didn't broadcast itself from the street. So the only thing that you see from this street elevation is the entrance, and which was reoriented and changed and made different than the ranch house. Different materials, different grid, different expression. This was also a house that we built, and this was done in the early 90s. We tried to reuse as much as we could, and the strategy here was to take this addition and treat it kind of like a wedge, kind of driven into the house, so that it appears at the front of the house as the entrance, and it reorients some of the partitions inside the house because the wedge was set at an angle to the existing house. It was set at an angle parallel to the property line, purposely to give it its own expression. The interiors were opened up. The flat ceiling of the ranch house was taken out. As many of you know, that the walls of these houses are held together by their ceilings. The ceilings keep the walls from falling out. So we had to substitute the ceilings with something else. So we did these structural ridges that have these steel kind of T's or trees that hold up the ridges so we could capture that space above the ceiling. The new structure, sorry, I went too far. The new structure you can see on the right has a different expression in its windows. We tried as much as possible to preserve the windows of the old building, even if they weren't all in exactly the same location. We reused them where we could. So the wing is on the right. You'll notice that the wing uses similar materials, but slightly different. The wing is sided with horizontal siding instead of shingles. The windows are metal and large panes instead of the smaller wood panes. The roof is not quite so tidy and neat as the old ranch house, so it has a little bit of a sort of a disconnected quality to it. But I think that it's important for these houses to stand on their own, or for the interventions that we conceive to have their own life. And here's a construction picture, and you can see the wing on the left being added, and how the materials are handled in a different way, just to express or preserve its footprints in time, if you will. The next project, and this is a shot of the house taken a few years ago after it's kind of grown in. The next project is a project of a type that we're fortunate to have many of, which is projects that are done at the kind of the boundary or the intersection between the land and the water. A lot of times it's the ocean, sometimes it's other bodies of water. The weather in these situations plays an even more important role than the weather normally does in a house, because the conditions are so harsh. And the fact that we're doing it in that location, in that harsh location, makes these seem even more like interventions. It makes the houses seem even more like they're coming between our experience of the site and the site itself. Because this is located on an island, a barrier island, the only access to the house is in the winter down the beach in a four-wheel drive vehicle, or during the summer by ferry and golf cart and things carried by hand. So the construction had to use materials that were not either labor or material intensive, so you see no concrete. The house just sits on basically what looks like toothpicks stuck in the sand. The plan is a pinwheel, and the idea of the pinwheel was to create within the pinwheel two basic spaces. One is kind of a public arrival space that kind of fronted along the street, which is a pedestrian street, and the other was kind of a private family space in the back. And then to create these three different volumes, one of which is the kind of communal gathering space, kitchen and sitting room, the sort of master suite, and then guests and children at the back. And all the rooms have at least two exposures, in some cases three. And the idea, again, is to just increase the experience and the connectivity with the environment. The interior is very simply done. It was unheated at the time we built it, unheated and not air conditioned. It's just open stud framing. And the materials consist of bamboo floors, plywood walls and ceilings. The cabinets are made of a combination of aniline dye, colored plywood, and painted plywood. The countertops, some of which are made of lab top material. You'll notice that the handrails, both inside and outside, are made of metallized rebar. And the rebar is used not only, we have no concrete here, but the rebar is used here because you can thread nuts onto the end of the rebar and turn it into a huge bolt. So you'll see that on the outside too, that the handrails on the outside are made of the same rebar. And the rebar, it's hard to see, but in the image you'll see a diagonals in there. They're used to brace the structure because the toothpicks are just sitting in the sand and they need to be braced so they don't fall over like a house of cards. And the picture on the right was taken a little later than the picture on the left, and you can see that already the house is starting to weather, and the materials used on the outside are also fairly weather tolerant. Horizontal cedar siding, cedar shingles, corrugated concrete panel roof. There are cement panels in parts of the house. You can see it above the doors of the sitting room. And so there's no finish that's on the outside of the house except the metal finish on the windows. Any questions or thoughts? And especially the stuff I went over already. If you see something again that you want me to explain a little bit more, please interrupt me. I've been instructed to minimize the length of time that I tortured you here tonight. So. This project actually is on the flyer for the lecture. It's called Surfside, and it's a different kind of intervention. The previous one was a new house. This is a house that existed, and in contrast to the modesty of the previous house, this house has higher aspirations, both in terms of its construction and materiality, and also in terms of where it's built. This thing is built right on the top of the dune, and sometimes in the winter, the ocean water laps right up against the base of the house. Because of the lengths that we went to preserve this house and rebuild it here, I think one legitimately has to ask whether projects like this ever satisfy the goals of sustainability. It's certainly sustaining a house that's there and not throwing it in a dumpster. But does it make sense to build on a barrier beach? And as with the previous project, we strive to attain some of these goals while understanding the need for, as Tim said, strategic clarity and careful execution of our craft. So the house is situated atop an Atlantic Ocean primary dune. It doesn't meet FEMA requirements with regard to height above floodwaters, and it doesn't meet FEMA requirements with regard to structure. The structure in the building envelope did not meet current wind zone requirements. It didn't meet current zoning and floodplain requirements for both the town and the state of New York. So in many, many ways, it was non-conforming. It was a structure that could never be built again. So we had two choices: to leave the structure where it was, or to try to rebuild it in place in a way that we considered more flood tolerant. And if we moved it, I'm sorry, leave it where it was and reconstruct it or move it. If we moved it, the house could have totally changed character. If you moved it back to a conforming location, it could have been a 20,000 square foot house instead of a 3,500 square foot house. So we tried to rebuild the house to coexist with the conditions there, and you'll see that there's some techniques. The concrete walls around the outside of the house keep the dune back and the floodwaters back when it does flood in the winter. The base of the house is clad with concrete panels, and the walls you'll see in the next picture, in the next pictures are made of concrete. We rebuilt the foundation. On the right are the piles that go into the sand. Those piles are driven to what's called refusal, so they drive them as hard as they can until they can't drive them anymore. And so they're not only driven into refusal, but they'll refuse to come out, theoretically. On top of the piles was put a grid of reinforcing steel, which was then enclosed in concrete. On the right, the images you see is the lower floor walls. The walls that are perpendicular to the beach are concrete. The walls that are parallel to the beach are breakaway, so that in the event that there's a catastrophic storm, the house would stay intact and not try to resist the storm. We elevated the house to where we thought the 100-year flood, where the storm surge would come, which is the image on the left. That's the existing house. We inserted a steel structure into the house. You can see in the image on the left that in the foreground there's a flat steel structure sitting on the ground. They're about to slide that house over on top of it and insert steel columns into the wall. So there's a kind of a grid inserted into that house that holds the whole thing together, and then that grid is tied down to the concrete walls and the concrete pile caps in the piles. The house was extended slightly. Here it is going back on its foundation. You can see the concrete walls underneath and the new steel structure underneath the old house. And the new house has been extended. Oops, has been extended. I pushed the wrong button. Basically, this piece of it was an extension added onto this end. And there was a similar extension added onto that end. The architectural strategy for the site, and I apologize for not having a site plan here, but the site plan didn't come out very well, and I thought it was better not to show it than to show a muddy image. But the strategy for the site was to create 3 structures. The first structure was a garden structure that was encased in the garden and not a structure on the waterfront like the main house. And this building also serves as a guest house. Any questions? Thoughts?
Of the original house?
Actually, it was a guy named Harry Bates who's still alive. Bates did a lot of work out there in the 70s and 80s. And lovely guy. He's now has a younger partner. And his buildings tended towards rounded corners and kind of clumsy, in my opinion, clumsy architectural expression. So the guest house is on the left. And Randall, you wanted to say something?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
If I understand it correctly, what was the reason for working with the original building as opposed to building new? Was that to grandfather in the zoning?
To grandfather in its location. And you'll see in a later slide where I show some images looking out from the house that's why the people bought it. They bought it because they loved its location. On the left here, you can see the front of the house is right on top of the dune. And in the winter, sometimes that dune grass that's right here ends up getting washed away. So the water will literally be right at the base of that concrete wall. They loved that, though. They loved going out on their porch or their deck and being able to look down the length of the dune. So the other 2 structures on the site are on the left, on the right-hand image, the left-hand structure is basically a powerhouse for the site. It has the generator, the heating equipment, and some of the geothermal equipment in it. It also serves as a overflow workspace and a end-to-end 2-bay garage, so you can park cars end-to-end in it. And in the summer, the owner uses that space as a studio, and that's why you see all the clear story windows on it. And it also served as a kind of a separator from the other buildings nearby the site to create an interior space on the site. And then, of course, the third building is the main house, which is the structure at the front. And here's two images looking out from the main house from upstairs. The image on the left is a window that really, to me, looks like a painting. And that is the, you know, kind of the crux of that location, is that when you look out from that window, you have this array of views down the beach and at the adjacent pond, which is what's showing there. And then when you sit on the inside of the house or out on the porch, you feel like you're right on the water. The house also has two photovoltaic systems, one on the guest house and one on the main house, and it uses a open loop geothermal system for heating and cooling. And that combination of PV panels and open loop systems is a sort of a no-brainer for summer houses, because the geothermal systems work really well with groundwater to cool the house in the summer, and the PV systems power the whole thing in the winter when they're not there. And it's almost a no-cost heating and cooling system because of the combination of PV and geothermal. You know, it's a lovely project. Dean Robbins has seen the house. It's a lovely spot, but I think you know, every winter I worry about whether this thing is going to be washed away, and only time will tell whether this intervention had any intelligence to it or not. So I'm going to show a couple of projects now that are part of our current work. This is a house built in '06 for a bachelor client, and it basically tries to do 3 or 4 things that we try to include in all of our work. One is not to build a very big house. This is 2,600 square feet and contains 3 bedrooms and 1 main room. The second is not to fight Mother Nature, the local building code. So you'll see here that the house in the site plan on the left, the house is here, it's set back about 150 feet from the bay. So there's not this imminent danger of the thing being washed into the sea. And the total constructed area is the main building here, which has a bedroom, a study, 2 guest rooms, and then 1 main room with a kitchen and living room in it. And then the pool, and under the pool is a garage and some mechanical space. So the total footprint on the ground is just over 2,600 square feet. The third is to tread lightly on the site, and this is a view taken from the water of the house and the path that leads from the driveway down to the house. You know, I'm of the opinion that where we live, and certainly probably where we all live, that nothing can compete with Mother Nature in terms of design or landscape. And that Mother Nature is best left alone or at best managed. So that was our goal here. And so the house sits very lightly on the site, and you know, leaves, there's no sense of an intrusion really, even though this is a new house on a site that was pristine before. And the fourth, of course, is to strive for sustainability, which we bring to all of our projects, but it's not always obvious. A flat-roofed glass box doesn't necessarily look like a sustainable house, but as I said, for a building that is basically a summer residence, that combination of PV panels and geothermal heating systems basically provides an almost no-cost heating and cooling system for the house. The other aspects of sustainability are the materials you use and how you treat them. And so the exterior materials of this house, this is a shot of the sunscreen on the south side. The sunscreen are these moving panels that keep the sun out of the building, and they're made of tropical hardwood. And the other materials besides the glass is zinc. And the zinc, you see the zinc in 2 forms there. One is in the zinc flashings we try to hide, and the other is in the zinc coating on the steel. The steel is metallized with molten zinc that's sprayed onto it, so that provides the weatherproofing. And of course, there's concrete that it's supported on the concrete base. The inside finishes are basically also concrete. There's a concrete floor, plaster, wood, There's another shot, and I'll show you some more wood, and the plaster in the bathrooms, there's no tile, the plaster is just waxed. And here's a shot of the main room on the left, and you'll see that the kitchen consists of just two islands that are floating in the space, and the ceiling over the kitchen is made of wood, so that when the doors are open on the left, there's big sliding doors here on both sides that can open, and you'll see that when the doors are open, the wood ceiling just goes in and out. Sort of, it's a sort of a conceit that the kitchen is a porch and not a contained part of the house. The living spaces, sit atop this concrete base, and the concrete base contains, as I said, all of the equipment for the building, including the pool equipment. It includes a garage and some storage. And the structure of the house, because it's a cantilever in two directions, is actually, the north and south walls are actually a truss. And if somebody here with more knowledge of structure than me can correct me, I think it's called a Virendale truss. And it's basically vertical steel columns with moment connections to these horizontal beams. It's not totally cantilevered. You can see here that there's support columns on both ends, but the north and south walls, along with the steel sections that support the floor and the roof, basically form a one-story truss. And unlike the previous project, Surfside, this is really a steel building. So the expression of the facade is meant to emphasize the fact that it's steel, whereas the other house is really a wood building into which steel was inserted to give it some stability. This is a renovation project. It was a 10,000 square foot house that had a 5,000 square foot basement that was habitable. And you can't see it, but it had this whole horrible 3-story quality on the beach. We basically filled in the site, you can see in the picture in the bottom, raising the level of the grade up to the main floor. We did that on both sides. This is the back side of the house on the left, and this is the finished house on the right. Is a 10,000 square foot house a sustainable project? I'm not sure it is, but again, it's a summer house. It could have gone in a dumpster, and it probably would have been another 10,000 square foot house if it had gone in a dumpster. So we preserved as much of this house as we could, and got rid of the round corners. And it's pretty spectacular because what it did was it reunited the site. It's in between a bay and the ocean. It reunited the building on that site so that you have views both of the ocean. The lower floor was converted to usable space, and this is a little garden outside this buried basement. This is actually an exercise room with this Japanese garden. So we used the space, but we just didn't, it improved the scale and the accessibility of the house. And this is a shot of the pool looking at the bay to the north. So we sort of turned the house into a bridge between the ocean and the bay. This is a typical type of house that we do. It's about 4,500 square feet. We call this Bluff House. It was finished about a year ago. And actually, I think our studio saw this house last fall or last summer. Again, similar strategies to the other projects. There's PV panels on the flat roof. There's a geothermal system. The materials are Western red cedar and cement panels used in a rain screen fashion, a mix of stone, zinc, and aluminum doors and windows. I would say that this kind of house is our sort of, if you will, bread and butter for our office. It's the thing that we do the most of, and for us it's very important that the craft of the house stand up to the design, and you'll see the shot on the right is showing an intersection in the rain screen between the cement panels and the cedar siding, and you can see the battens behind the cedar siding that hold it off of the outside surface of the structure. Any questions? Everybody asleep now? Yes? Yes.
Still get into how much building do you still get into?
We don't physically do any more building. I came to believe that the collaboration between the builder and the architect was a valuable one, especially after I had educated myself. I had been building for about 10 years. From the time I left New York to move out here, which was in '85, till about the early '90s, we built everything. And in part it was because I didn't like what was going on in architecture. And in part because I wanted to educate myself not only about building, but about money. You know, how much it costs to do things and why. And so having gone through that now, I consider myself more educated and able to work better with builders. And I think builders like working with us because we're informed about the process. And so I really value the collaboration because builders, it's like any collaboration. Everybody can bring something to the discussion. Anybody else? This is a project in Switzerland. It's an image, of course. It's not a real photograph, but it's a 1930s farmhouse. It was built between the two wars by a German industrialist who wanted some security, so he moved to Switzerland. And the house was built in the 30s, and we're renovating it and converting it to larger use by a family. And again, some of the same strategies and design pieces that we use here. Interestingly enough, the rain screen siding installation, which we do a lot of, was really developed in Switzerland. I went over there 15 years ago to do a project for a client because they thought we were experts in wood. You know, the Americans are experts in wood, and it turned out they were way ahead of us, doing all of their projects in rain screen and engineered lumber and engineered panels. And this is a project that we did in Zurich about 10 years ago, in addition to also a 1930s Zurich house overlooking the lake. And it's, as I said earlier, I'm a believer that our interventions, especially with older houses, need to stand on their own 2 feet and need to really preserve our footprints in time and not confuse the historical record about when something was built. So I'm not a believer in matching, you know, historical styles when I add on or renovate a house. This is a project on the island of Mallorca, off the coast of Spain, and it's a project that's in the design stage right now. And it's also made of African tropical hardwood and locally available stone on the island. The upper floor and even the lower floor windows all have a panel system that closes off the windows because in the winter this site gets wild. It's 60 to 80 feet above the Mediterranean, but the waves in the winter will literally breach that bluff and cover that house with salt water. So it's very corrosive, and certainly in terms of utility makes the house unusable without that protection. This is a project that's under construction that Tim alluded to in China. It's about 1 million square feet of high-rise apartments and a series of townhouses organized around a park. And it's very, very compact, in part to preserve the surrounding hills, which the Chinese are slightly superstitious about building in. And so that was kind of a catalog of some of the projects that we've been doing recently. And although most of our work is done on Long Island and in the Bridgehampton area, we do have these projects that are both outside of the area and also it's not all housing. We're also doing some institutional work and some commercial work, and we're also working on some workforce housing, which I think is critical to our future, both where we live and also here in Syracuse. So I'm going to show you two building types that I think are the future of my practice in our office. And this is a little project on the island of Antigua in the Caribbean. And to those of you who have been there, has anybody been to the Caribbean? you know that it's just a crazy abundance of wind and sunshine, right? And yet, there's very few places there that really do anything with it. They could be so totally self-sufficient without fossil fuels. So this is actually a project that's under construction now. It's really a solar power plant, although it's masked in the form of a guest house. And the guest house is under construction. And, you know, again, going back to the first project I showed you, which was the project for my mother and father, the question is, what is the right architecture for a project that is a solar power plant? What is the right image for a project that strives to address sustainability issues? Does it need to have a special expression? I'm undecided about it, frankly. This building could very well not be a solar power plant. It could be just a guest house on the island. The structure contains 2 bedrooms, there and a couple of bathrooms, and then there's a little kitchen and a large sitting area. Underneath the structure, all the equipment is housed, and it's also a cistern to capture rainwater, because there's no rainwater there's no water source on the island. The PV array, which is almost 20 kW, powers a site that contains 5 or 6 structures, about 10 bedrooms, and is used by sometimes multiple families. And the PV array runs the whole thing, everything on the site, and it'll run it for 2 days without sunshine. And as you know, there's practically never a time when there's no sunshine in Antigua. Unfortunately, down there, they don't have it's actually against the law to build your own power plant on Antigua, and they have no way of dealing with the excess power, because there is excess power from this system. Where we live in Long Island, the excess power can be put back into the grid. So we have what's called net metering there. And in the island of Antigua, they don't have net metering, and they have no way to deal with the excess. So on Long Island, you pump the excess back into the grid, and then you take it back out at night when you don't have the PV panels running. So you balance it out. Here, the excess that isn't needed for running the property goes into a battery bank in the basement of this structure. Right, and all the power on this island right now is generated comes from generators using petroleum. And it costs about 50 cents a kilowatt to buy. I don't know what you're paying up here, but where I live, it's 23 cents a kilowatt, and that seems expensive. And unlike, just to talk a little bit about the architecture, this is in this warm southern climate, so the house is actually oriented away from the sun. The house is oriented towards the north, because you're looking for shade and cooling. And on the south side, those wood louvers serve to control light and ventilation, and they're basically operable sunscreens. I don't know if this is the right image for a solar power plant. As I said, I have mixed feelings about it, but I think I'm happy with it. It's become a demonstration project. The Minister of Energy of the island is coming to film it and use it as a tool to promote sustainability for the islands, which seems like a no-brainer. The last project, I'm sorry, any questions or thoughts? So the last project is particularly near and dear to my heart. It's a project in the design stage right now. It really represents where I think we want to be headed in terms of where we live and where the bulk of our practice is, and that is a basically simple, affordable house that is carbon neutral. And this is our attempt at that. We have a client who supports it. They have fairly limited means. The budget for this house is probably somewhere between $1.25 and $1.5 of what we'd like it to be for where we live. But the clients are admirers of mid-century modern architecture, the case study houses, our work, and so in many ways they're perfect clients, except for this budget issue, which is always a problem. So it can't be built by conventional means, and what we're exploring is a pre-engineered steel frame company, actually based in Arizona, that will build the shell of this house for us, and then we'll finish it locally. We expect that when it's done, as I said, the house will be somewhere between 25 and 50% of what we would normally spend in a house. And you know, it's a challenging set of constraints, but I think there's a need for it. It's a beautiful site. It's a wooded, hilly site covered with beech and oak trees. And the house is oriented slightly west of south, which is perfect for solar. The plan is a simple rectilinear plan. It floats because it's on a sloping site. The house kind of floats over the edge of the slope. And the lower floor contains 2 rooms and also parking for the car under the house. The upper floor is a fairly conventional floor plan with a small screen porch on the left, and a single main room that has the kitchen and sitting area, entrance, a kind of a study bedroom, bathroom, and then the master. Yep.
Can I ask, what's the per square foot cost?
We're trying to get this done for under 200, which when people come to me, and this will be shocking, but when people come to me in where I live and say, you know, what should I be thinking of in terms of a budget if I want a fairly high quality house, I tell them 400, to start at 400. So the owners will live principally on this floor. In the winter, passive heat gain from the large expanses of south-facing glass will be stored in the thermal mass of the main floor. The main floor is going to be concrete. Heat buildup in the summer will be taken care of by shading from the deciduous trees, which leaf out in the summer, and being able to open up every room to both sides for cross ventilation. I discovered in the house that I did for my parents, which faced south, it had just sheer flat-facing walls with glass in them. That I didn't even think about sunscreens in those days. That if you could open the windows, even though the sun was out, the heat just wouldn't build up; it would dissipate. Supplemental heating and cooling again will come from an open-loop geothermal system, and with backup gas boiler and PV panels on the roof. And excess power in this instance will be able to go back into the grid during the day through the use of net metering, which basically means the meter goes backwards. You build up a credit when you're pumping electricity back into the grid, and they'll be able to offset the gain during the day, or they will offset the gain during the day by the use of electricity at night. So we think when the house is up and running, it'll be energy neutral throughout the course of the year. At the moment, we're working on energy modeling for the house. We're doing a very sophisticated energy modeling analysis of it to make sure it works before we develop the design and the details anymore. And by the way, we think it is on budget. We think that we're going to be, right now, we think that all of the systems and the architecture is coming in at around $550. Single family houses aren't all that I do, as I said, but early on in my career, and I don't know exactly when it happened, but early on in my career, and I think it was when I was working in New York initially, I realized that it's what I wanted to do. I love single family houses. It's a contradiction for sure. You know, at a time when the population is moving away from suburban and rural areas into the cities, I think the city living is increasing at the rate of 5 million people a month. And already half the population lives in urban environments. Single family house seems like an anachronism. I don't think it'll ever go away, and I enjoy it. And you know, some of the reasons are it's very personal. The client is the user, and so every client is different. And you get to work with different personalities. Traditionally, I think houses have been among the building types that are most have the most creative license. I mean, when you think of Wright or or Charlie Gwathmey or any Mies van der Rohe, what do you think of? At least you also think of the single-family houses they did. It's also, they're among the building types with the most programmatic individuality. Every house is different, every client is different. So there may be some cookie cutter aspects to houses that we want, that we would pursue in order to achieve our goals of sustainability or affordability. But I think that as an architect, there's a lot of license, and you can do a lot of projects in a short amount of time. Yes.
I was just curious about the communication between your office and the clients in terms of the sustainable design.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that they come to you about, or is that something you're coming to?
You know, the whole discussion changed about 15 years ago for me. We had not ever particularly been pushing sustainable design as part of our practice. But when the internet and websites came along, we decided that that's all we were going to put on the website. And so we put only houses that we liked that were modern, and only houses that we thought supported our, what we thought was important. And it created both it was both an attractant, it created its own magnetism that brought clients to us, but it was also a filter. So that when people looked at our houses and they weren't interested in sustainable design, but they wanted, some postmodern McMansion, they just didn't talk to us. So it's always part of the discussion, and certainly dollars are part of it, but there's also lots of technical problems. There's places where you can't do some of these things so easily. Geothermal systems are an absolute no-brainer where we live because we live on a sand pile. And the water is 15 feet below the surface, and the water temperature is a constant 50 to 55 degrees year-round. So it's perfect for cooling. And if it's a summer house, and you go away from it in the winter and you set the thermostat at 55 degrees, you're almost getting heat out of the groundwater. So it works well where we are, and there's lots of places where it works well, but that doesn't mean it should be confined to just places where it works perfectly. Yep.
It seemed to be really up the ante when you started talking about carbon neutrality of the building.
Right.
I wonder if you could address that just a bit.
Well, I didn't mean carbon neutrality in terms of the construction, but I meant carbon neutrality in terms of its operations. I meant power neutral when the house is built. Carbon neutrality when you construct a house is almost a myth because you have to offset all of the carbon that you consume in the construction process somehow. And how are you going to do that in a single family house? Are we buying carbon credits? Are we reforesting areas? You could certainly do that, and that may become part of the discussion at some point. In Eastern Long Island, all the water in Eastern Long Island comes from an underground lake. And so what they had the wisdom to do about 30 years ago, realizing that the underground lake was being polluted by groundwater penetration, by runoff penetration, was to preserve large areas of it that they would offset development, and the pine barrens were born then. And so, maybe that's the carbon neutrality that we can achieve at some point, to be able to preserve more of the, the carbon dioxide consuming plants and vegetation. That's why the revegetation thing and the site issues are so important. But what I meant to say was that this house will be power neutral when it's built. It won't consume any more power than it needs. It won't need to consume any more power than it can produce. And we can't achieve all of our sustainability goals on every project. I don't think we've achieved, what would be the ideal project yet. So it's something we constantly strive for. So just in conclusion, I just want to say a couple of things. I subscribe to what the great black educator Booker T. Washington said, which was that, and this is sort of a paraphrase, but there's as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. And so we're not all gonna, what I wanted to say was that each of us is gonna pursue our own careers. And there's as much excitement and dignity and satisfaction in pursuing the career that's important to you as in pursuing the career that's held out as the example. So I'm not holding this out as an example to you, except as my own trajectory. And So I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts, which is just to trust your own instincts whenever they speak, because for a while I kind of floundered around doing what other people thought I should do, and when I started doing what I wanted to do, it all of a sudden fell in place. Because if you do what you want to do, you'll do it well. And not everything you do is going to support what you think your goal is. There's going to be detours. Don't be afraid of the detours. The detours can be instructional, but just keep your eyes on, where you think you want to head. And, always make what it is that's important to you part of every conversation. So going back to your question about sustainability, every time I talk to a client, we talk about sustainability, because I think it's important. And sometimes you just have to put one foot in front of the other. Sometimes you have to get a job, or you get a job, or you get a commission, and it's not ideal, and you just have to keep doing it, because it's all grist for the mill. Everything you do is going to make you better. And architecture's a journey. You're not. It's never over. There is no destination in architecture. And for me, what's the meaning in all of this? And I was talking to Anda about this before, Professor French before, and or actually it was not Professor French, but it was Anne Munley, and they sort of look alike, right? For me, what the meaning in all of this is that experiencing, what the world has to offer is its own reason for being. That's the meaning for me. And the opportunities are unlimited. And it really does seem to me sometimes that we live in a perfect world. Thank you.